Hi, I'm Robin, and I was asking myself this question: why don't they understand my Vietnamese? And I guess I'm not the only one who is doing so. So, what do we expect? Whether you have been speaking Vietnamese for a short time or for a longer time, it's often the case that they do not understand you. Is it because you simply have no sense of language, or you're not studying hard enough? Well, that's probably not the situation, but sometimes we just don't have reasonable expectations. And yes, it sometimes happens that you have been studying the wrong thing. I learned during my educational study that when the student fails, you have to take a good look at the teaching material. So I did. But let's start by looking at what it's like when we travel in our own country. One day we arrived somewhere in a cute village with friendly people who speak our own mother tongue, but somehow we really don't understand them. And when this happens in our own country, do you think it's strange that a local Vietnamese shopkeeper who sees us for the first time doesn't understand your Vietnamese? So keep in mind that in many countries the local speak only their own language and that of their neighbors. They do not expect someone from far away to speak their language. This is especially the situation outside the tourist centers. It happens to me all the time that when I try to speak Vietnamese in a local shop, they very often respond with "No English, no English." And then I say slowly and clearly, "Tôi nói tiếng Việt." After which again, "No English, no English." At my wit's end, I write down on a piece of paper, "Tôi nói tiếng Việt." Then I see their face light up, and next there comes a stream of sounds I can't make any sense of. Well, the basic problems we have with a new language is closely related to the order in which we learn the new language. And there's a huge difference between those two versions. The spoken version is much simpler and strongly locally influenced. The written version is much richer and more general. Both spoken and written language are carriers of culture, but the spoken language is more locally oriented about usual topics, while the written language is a language we use to communicate on sometimes complicated topics with people who aren't on site or no longer with us at all. We first learn the spoken version of our native language. Then, after some years, we learn the written version. Learning a foreign language almost always starts from the written language, and as we saw, there is a clear distance between the script-based language and the language spoken from the mother tongue. The result may be that your language is sometimes just too good, too beautiful, too formal, too clearly understood by local people. So then communication is speaking, but also listening. What people usually do not realize is that people from different cultures do not only speak differently, but sometimes also listen very differently. The difference is very large between cultures with a language based on sound, such as the alphabetic language, and cultures with a language based on a visual script, such as Vietnamese. In logographic script, words are built up with strokes. Only when the character is finished does one see the meaning, and only then the pronunciation follows. The words are short and have only one syllable. The pronunciation is strictly tied to that character. A word that is pronounced slightly different can mean something completely different, and that applies to all the words. This is very different from a sound-based script, where one can create a variation on the original meaning of the word just by slightly changing the sound. one often hears halfway through speaking what is meant, and not just in terms of the vocabulary meaning of the word. In alphabetic language, sound is also used to indicate emotional meanings, among other things. This is not done with character writing. Emotional meanings are made clear by grammar and adding, or by adding a specific character, but not by using extra sound. Therefore, Vietnamese people, their attention is focused on other aspects of what is being said, so they listen in a different way. People who are used to alphabetic language will, especially in the beginning, pronounce Vietnamese words with extra sound. Vietnamese people who cannot speak English are not used to this way of using sounds at all. That's why they have a great difficulty to understand what is meant. This regularly leads to a strange situation. For example, the other day I needed engine oil for my motorbike, so I went to the garage where I usually go, and I say to the helper, "Toi kan jou mooi. I need new oil." Because last month I was in the south, where they pronounced the sans serif D as a G, but I was now in the north, and there you pronounce the D as a Z, so that boy didn't understand my jou. I should have said, "Toi kan zou mooi." Now, anyone who is used to building words based on sound will, when they do not understand something, look for words that are somewhat similar in terms of pronunciation. But the Vietnamese don't do that, because words that sound similar normally have a completely different meaning, so the boy disappeared to the back and the boss came himself. He knows me and immediately understood what I said and gave me the oil. That's the difference between a Vietnamese who is used to foreign and one who isn't. And once more, excuse me for my Vietnamese. When I have to pronounce it right now, it's even more difficult than when I'm in Vietnam, because then I often talk kind of Vietnamese, but then it comes more natural out of my mouth. But now it's very difficult to speak Vietnamese. However, the fact that people do not understand your Vietnamese properly is often due to the special situation to the Vietnamese language. The use of the Latin script makes it seem as the words are built from sound, but that's not the case. The script was not invented by Vietnamese to make the rich Vietnamese culture accessible for foreigners, but by priests who wanted to make the Bible accessible to Vietnamese. To this end, they used Latin letters to represent the pronunciation of the characters. They found the fact that there were far too few vowels for the Vietnamese language less relevant, because the script was intended for Vietnamese and they could speak already their own language. But for foreigners who are learning to pronounce Vietnamese correctly, this is a problem, as we will see later. Why they pay so little attention to this aspect in existing courses is very simple. Well, they are not aware of this because they are used to their language and its characteristics. Because beyond that, Vietnam has fought for centuries against all kinds of foreign powers, and the occupiers have caused enormous destruction. In recent decades, Vietnam has to spend a lot of time and money on repairing hospitals, roads, schools, among other things. Investing in developing Vietnamese courses for foreigners was less of a priority. And much useful material had left behind by the Western occupiers who wanted to learn Vietnamese. The problem is that this material is based on the idea that Vietnamese is an alphabetic language, and it's difficult to learn because of the use of the tones. And that's a persistent misunderstanding that in itself will not be so bad, but when a single part, an important part, receives a lot of attention, a distorted picture often arises of both that part and its importance. For the Vietnamese language, in my opinion, this is the situation regarding the tones. too much attention to the tones and therefore not enough to the vocals and the importance of the word combinations. And it's precisely those last two aspects that make Vietnamese understandable, as we will see later. But first, be aware that the tones are not accents. Official Vietnamese has 6 tones. By pronouncing a word with a different tone, the word takes a different vocabulary meaning. The word ma, M-A, is often used to clarification. Depending on the tone used, ma means a mother, rice seedling, a gravestone, horse, bud or ghost. However, English not only has exact the same tones, one only has to think of how to pronounce the word yes, for example, so that the meanings change from yes, yes, yes. So the difference is that the Vietnamese, you don't emphasize a word by using a tone. The tones only represent a vocabulary meaning, while in English the tones also indicate an emotional meaning. And we often do that very emphatically. And they can also be used for a whole sentence to make it, for example, interrogative by raising the last word. The last word, the last word, yeah. If you compare the way of pronouncing tones in Vietnamese and in English, you actually have to pronounce them in Vietnamese without emphasis. And that is precisely what interferes with the ample attention and the intensive practice of those tones during the courses. That makes you pronounce them the way you use sound in English, and then you will get pineapple juice, as I did in this example. I was in a bar and wanted to drink coconut juice. So I said to the waiter, "Tôi thích uống nước dừa." Well, in fact I said, "Tôi thích uống nước dừa." I like to drink coconut juice. Well, that is what I wanted to drink, but if we want to indicate in English that we really like the juice, we can emphasize that juice. So I like to drink coconut juice. However, dừa is coconut while dừa is pineapple. Because I wanted to make clear that I wanted coconut, I emphasized dừa. So it almost sounds like dừa. And thus a Vietnamese waiter will hear, "Tôi thích uống nước dừa." Sorry. Because they are not used to the sounds like that. When a Vietnamese who wants to indicate that they really likes the juice, they will indicate this by adding the word zat. Tôi rất thích uống nước dừa. I regularly forgot that. And in this case, I ended up with pineapple juice, even though I don't like that very much. But when they heard that I actually wanted coconut juice, I immediately received a free lesson of the use of tones, because the importance of tones is just as ingrained as the use of aspirin by me. It also helps against everything. In this example, this seemed to be correct, but I was very aware of the tone to use, but not of the fact that by emphasizing the word I was making the tone sound different, which changed the meaning of the word. Another typical example of how alphabetic language are sonically connected to the content of the text is how we say, "He goes down." As we say, we emphasize the meaning by the speak this way, down, because how the characters, the word down goes down. The Vietnamese have not learned to speak this way because how the characters of the logographic script are pronounced is independent of their meaning. That is why Vietnamese would say, "An I đi xuống," with the sentence going up. For me it's strange, for Vietnamese it's normal. When listening they pay attention to other things. However, make no mistake too, Vietnamese can speak loudly too, but that's different and not really respected by other Vietnamese. So in conclusion, I think it's much more important, instead of paying unnecessary attention to the tones, to pay more attention to the things that make the Vietnamese language so different and interesting. Because of this excessive attention, the impression is given that they are more difficult and important than pronunciation of vowels and the use of combining words. In the follow-up video, we will see that this gives a completely wrong impression of what is important to pronounce Vietnamese correctly. And yes, it's a bit strange that someone like me who doesn't speak Vietnamese explained to people who do speak it how they can teach it better. Well, on the one hand, since my studies in educational science, I specialize in studying and developing teaching materials for beginners. On the other hand, Vietnam has many and by far the best motorcyclists, but very few can repair motorbikes. It's the same with language. They speak it fluently, but especially because of the switch from logographic script to the use of Latin letters, there is still a lot to research, and as an outsider we often see different things. So in the next video I will continue with the tones and the importance of the vocals and word combinations. See you in the next video. Thank you.